I'm Connor Old, and welcome back to another episode of the Top 10 of the 2010s, and here we are on the final list of original content, the Top 10 Best Picture winners of the decade. I decided to leave this to the very end to sort of transition us eventually into the Olds Oscar countdown. We're about a month away from actually starting the series, so that's going to happen in the middle of December. Essentially how the next month of the series of the Top 10 of the 2010s is going to go is going to be the traditional 3-week rollout for this list. And then there's going to be one video, just one video on my top 10 favorite movies of the decade. And I've talked about a lot of them before, so it's going to be a regurgitation of what I've said in those videos, sort of clipped together in one final video. But for the most part, this is going to be essentially the final list that I'm going to be doing. But if you're new to the series, what I do every single week is talk about some of my favorite movies. I've covered the top 10 lists of a bunch of different genres: romance, sci-fi, fantasy, different types like performances, and I've had a real blast doing it. And I seem to think you guys have been enjoying it as well. But the Oscar season is upon us now. The Olds Oscar Countdown is the flagship of this series and something I'm still very passionate about and want to give you the best Oscar advice. So if you've been a fan of these episodes, these sort of lists, stick around for the Olds Oscar Countdown, and where I give my predictions for the upcoming Oscars happening in April, which is why we're doing it a little bit later this year. And I'm assuming you are, because you're watching this video, the top 10 Best Picture winners of the decade. So these are movies that, only 10 of them are from this decade, that won Best Picture. Normally, I do the top 5 honorable mentions, and then go for my picks from 10 to 7, and then next week 6 to 2, and then finally a video on my favorite romance movie of the decade. But how we're doing it this week is, just because there's only 10, we're going to, of course, have no honorable mentions. I thought about maybe doing Best Picture nominations, but I've covered a lot of those movies, so I wanted to really talk about just the winners and try to find some sort of historical context and some through line between all the winners, but also give you some of my thoughts on my favorite of these movies and where I sort of rank them amongst each other. And if you go to the description, you can see timestamps for the different movies. If you want to jump around and hear my thoughts on things, definitely check that out. So without further ado, my number 10 pick is going to be The Shape of Water.
Oh God, it's not even human. If I told you about her, what would I say? I wonder.
From the master myth maker of the 21st century, Guillermo del Toro, who's already established a cult fan base within Hollywood that went to the mainstream here with The Shape of Water winning Best Picture. So it was no doubt that when his new movie had rapturous applause and won the Golden Lion at the Venice Film Festival, that this was going to be a serious Oscar contender. However, personally, I haven't been a huge fan of Del Toro's work. It's sort of a hit or miss filmography for me. Either I really like the movie, or sometimes it just doesn't work for me, and he sort of vacillates in and out of that. And the only reason why this is sort of at the number 10 position is that ultimately it didn't work for me. With that being said, there's still some really interesting things here. There's still some interesting things I'd recommend about the movie, and I definitely don't begrudge people who really appreciated this movie. For one, the structure of the movie is really interesting. It has this sort of fairy tale-esque story structure and plot mechanics, so that it allows for a little bit more of the fantastical, the surreal to come into it. That the way it's structured, by it being this fairy tale in terms of its way of telling the stories, and the characters are very much stereotypical and caricatures in certain ways, and not necessarily a bad thing, but just they're very specific, and this is this type of person, and this is this kind of a guy, and this is a bad, evil villain. But because we have this sort of traditional fairy tale, easy to understand, almost childlike perspective to the movie, it allows for the world to feel a little bit more accepting of the romance, and that's sort of the main hurdle of the movie, is to convince the audience that the romance between a fish man and a woman is realistic and is believable. But I think the way the story is structured with the fairy tale is really apt in making that relationship seem more authentic. Rather than saying in an ultra-realistic, gritty movie, you'd be like, wait, why there's this fish guy here? It does have some of that whimsical elements that work with the movie, and also can add in. It doesn't feel out of the blue if we add in a fantastical, surreal thing. You're not necessarily questioning it, because this is how the movie is structured. You almost expect it out of the way. If you accept this element of the fish man, then you'll accept these other elements. And that allows Guillermo to really show off a lot of his creativity and fun, interesting sequences and ways to visualize a lot of the themes he's conveying. The performances are great, particularly Sally Jenkins being this sort of quiet, reserved, but incredibly empathetic character who you're always sort of rooting for just because of how she portrays her. And of course, being deaf, she can't speak, so she has to rely just on her performance through her sort of facial dimensions and really communicate that really well. And then Richard Jenkins is a sort of talky best friend who brings a sort of audience perspective to the romance, just being like the, wait, what, huh? What's going on? That sort of grounded element is really a necessary element to the movie. And I think Jenkins works well with Sally Hawkins to be also sort of that traditional solid friend role, but he really excels in it. The cinematography is also something that's always stuck with me. A few films really commit to this idea of a turquoise color, and it's just every frame is this green turquoise kind of drenched color, where we have certain sequences whether we're underwater or of course this turquoise and the green of the fishman himself, where that's all we see. The production design is just solid green in the laboratories and things like that. There's really sort of a good use of color and color theory within the movie, particularly just really emphasizing this idea of water, of green, of turquoise, and it's something that's visually dynamic and has always stuck with me after seeing the movie. Yeah, I think at the end of the day, the romance was the really thing I just couldn't get ahead of. That I think if the movie works for you, you really believe in that romance, so that when the sort of sentimental elements happen at the end, you're really emotionally invested and moved, and you're totally in it. But if you can't just get on board with that element there, like I wasn't, you sort of, at least how my experience was, start to see a little bit more of the mechanics. Because you're distant from actually believing in the romance, you see the mechanics, you go, oh, I see what he's doing here, oh, and you're sort of you're like, I didn't get it, I wasn't invested, so now you're sort of just feeling nothing, and you see this moment as, wait, why is this happening? So there's sort of an emotional distance that I occurred, just because maybe I think there's a little bit of a mischaracterization in terms of the assumption that people will fall in love with this fish creature just by being a fish creature, maybe because Del Toro is so interested in creatures and the odd, and a lot of his movies are interested in that he just assumes the audience will be as well. But for me, I just didn't feel anything at the end because I wasn't able to emotionally connect to the main romance, which is ultimately the heart of the movie. So for me, it just didn't connect, unfortunately. But like I said, I don't begrudge it anyone that really enjoyed the movie, and I think it's definitely well crafted. You can clearly see there's a vision behind here, so I love celebrating those type of movies, but for me, unfortunately, it just didn't really work out that way. Now, I also want to talk about at the end of these list parts is the idea of holding up. This idea that, will it stand the test of time? Will people remember this? Because I did a Forgotten Oscar Films series on this channel where I would look at past Oscar Best Picture nominations of movies I hadn't even heard of that completely were lost to time, even some Best Picture winners. So I wonder, will these winners or a lot of these nominations, will the people even remember that these movies existed? What will their cultural lasting impact will be? And I think this one will have one due to the fact that Del Toro is a well-respected filmographer, an auteur who's going to get a lot of movies made in the future as well, and is well-respected within the industry. And this is his sort of, at the very least, historical Best Picture winner, probably one of his best movies. So if you're a fan of his, and I think he'll sort of have a lasting cinematic impact, The Shape of Water will be remembered in that respect. Then with my number 9 pick, I'm going to go with The Artist. Maybe the most maligned Best Picture winner of the decade. Oh, that's a really tough category to go into. In a way, the Best Picture winner can be a curse. I think that some people, it has to be a masterpiece liked by everyone, critics, commercial, everybody, and then if it wins Best Picture, and then it's kind of okay, but even people who see it afterwards will go, well, I don't think, maybe it was a little overhyped. That's the problem with the Best Picture winner. You're saying it's the best movie of the year. People say it's the greatest movie of all time in this hyperbole kind of a journalistic role that sometimes we live in, so that when people see these movies, they can be underwhelmed. But I sort of divide the interpretation and perception of Best Picture winners in two ways. Either the movie was just okay, and it wasn't like another movie should have won. It was just like, really, that movie, that won Best Picture, that was the best of the year? Oh, it's kind of underwhelming. Or it's the other one. Or it's, I can't believe that one. That one beat out my favorite movie. That beat out the sort of obvious one that has had the legacy that we've seen for so many years to come. You know, movies like Ordinary People in 1980 or 1990, Dances with Wolves. Perfectly fine movies. I think actually really great movies in something like the case of Ordinary People, but they are sort of looked down upon because Raging Bull should have won or Goodfellas should have won. It's the movie that should have won that sort of knocks down the peg of the movie that actually did win. But then I actually think The Artist is not this case. I think 2011 was kind of a weak year for film, and that's one of the situations where I think a lot of people are wondering, oh, it's a fun kind of a movie, but is it really the best of the year? That was sort of the question that everyone has, and I think its lasting impact will sort of be that idea. But I also think, just in terms of the historical perspective, I think Michel Hazanavicius is a director who hasn't had a super illustrious career afterwards, so it's not like he's going to be this Guillermo del Toro figure where people are going to revisit his movies. He sort of has this one hit. But then also someone like Jean Dujardin, who won the Oscar for the Best Actor here, is also an actor who hasn't had sort of a lot of, in terms of Hollywood A-list appeal that some of the other people have had. So people wonder, like, well, I don't really remember him. Why did he win over Brad Pitt or who not? So there's a couple things that sort of go against it because they didn't have these great careers. It's sort of just this individual movie that people are go, wait, what is that? Do I even remember that? But I think the fact is that it actually is a good movie. Whether or not it's deserved to win Best Picture is not the conversation we're really having. I just want to look at the winners, see some comments through line, and give my opinion on some of them. And even though it's at number 9 here, I still enjoyed the movie. And I think people will too, in terms of looking back on it, that it'll be not only a really entertaining movie for those people who watch it, but I actually think it may be the most fascinating movie to ever win Best Picture this decade. Because if you think about it, this is a black and white movie, it's a silent movie, and it made over $100 million and won 5 Oscars. I mean, just as a historical relic, that's a really fascinating thing to me, because we don't see that too often. It's a complete ode in every way to old school Hollywood, and is made like a silent film. This year, we're going to be talking a lot in the Oscar race about Mank, David Fincher's new movie. And similarly, that's a black and white movie that's shot and sort of meant to feel like an old movie. But I think in a lot of ways, The Artist did that idea first, but even to a further extent, the fact that it's a silent movie. And I think the credit of the movie is that I think it's really fun, I think it's funny, it has some sort of stereotypical stuff, and maybe not super impactful, and that I think about it every single day, but my time in watching it was never not enjoyable. And I think that's a credit, because silent movies for a lot of people are sort of old school. If you watch a silent movie today, even if they're an hour and 15 minutes, they can feel like a little bit of a slog, because the pacing is just completely different than the movies we have now. I mean, they are even completely different than the movies of the 70s. So to make a silent movie that feels like a pacing of a traditional silent movie, would still be entertaining, to still work for a modern day audience, and still keep them engaged and have these funny physical humor bits, and have some sort of linear story that's interesting and keeps you engaged, it's actually a real testament to the filmmaking craft. And that's one of the big highlights of the movie. I definitely understand why I got nominated for all these Oscars, because the craft is really impeccable. I mean, just every little detail feels authentic to the time period. Jean Dujardin, the way he's styled and the way he emotes, and all that sort of grinning and faces he makes to the camera that they sort of mentioned in the movie is really a great and feels period accurate. The story is very easy to follow. And one part that's a little bit of a criticism, because the story is very sort of about this guy who is having a falling career, and then when the talkies come in, the sort of other Peggy Miller comes up and is the new hot thing, and he sort of suffers with that depression. It's something that we've seen lots of times before, especially if you've seen a lot of movies, and feels very sort of predictable. That being said, it's still a silent movie, so the beats have to be obvious and predictable. There can't be a lot of subtlety to it, because you're taking out an element of modern day movie making, a big element, and trying to make a movie without it. But like I said, the technical elements, the cinematography, the way it sort of moves the camera feels very period accurate and works and serves to get that overall storytelling idea that even the production design, the sets and everything, it really comes together to make this feel authentic. And you never question, once you're in the middle of it, is this a movie that came out in 2011? You feel like it's a movie that you're watching for film history class or something like that. It feels like an old movie that you'd watch on TCM or something like that. So despite having a sort of traditional, obvious story, I think the story works well. It keeps you engaged. Just for a silent movie, I think it's really great in that respect. maybe you could say it shouldn't have won Best Picture, but I think the way people will respect it, the way people will look back on it, will be sort of like, wait, what's the artist? Why do I have to know about it? But the people that do watch it will actually be pretty surprised. They'll be go, hey, I actually enjoyed it. I don't think there's a lot of people who hate the artist. I think they're like, oh, this is funny, this is whimsical. Maybe why did this win Best Picture? But maybe it was just a bad year. And who cares if it's worth it or not? It did win Best Picture. Is it a good movie? I think so. Did I enjoy it? Yes. And I think just as a technical craft, even on itself, it's definitely worth watching. Getting prepared for Mank or something like that. If you want to see a modern day movie that feels like an old movie, definitely check out The Artist. Then with my number 8 pick, I'm going to go with 12 Years a Slave.
I was a free man. I'm not a slave.
A movie that feels like one of the most important Best Picture movies of the decade, and one of the most harrowing movies of the decade. A portrait about a free man named Solomon Northup who gets kidnapped and forced into slavery for 12 years. It's a really heart-wrenching, emotional, impactful, hard to watch at times movie, but really well done through the craft and the decision-making by Steve McQueen. Now, this is not the first slave movie we've ever seen. As a matter of fact, there's a little bit of a stereotype that whenever a black person, say, wins an Oscar or gets recognized, it has to be a slave movie, it'd be something like Amistad or movies like that in the past. But what's great about this movie, I think maybe is the most defining of the slave Oscar-type movies, is that it doesn't do the Oscar-type things. The sort of parody movie of this would be like showing these really harrowing sequences, and then when there's a moment of hope and he's about to escape, the score swells up and people start crying and give big speeches. I mean, that's the sort of parody version of that, but that's not what this is, and that's thanks to Steve McQueen being an excellent director and just sort of understanding how to use the visual medium of film to maximal effects. That Steve McQueen has always been a director with Hunger or Shame or Widows. He's always been a visual director and tells the story at the first part with the visual element rather than, say, a dialogue with a Sorkin or something like that. And I think that really serves well for this story because the emotional parts don't come from swelling music or big speeches. They come from these small visual elements. That it's a mix of subtlety and specificity. That we learn about the slave trade a lot. We learn about how it happens, the consequences of not picking 200 pounds of cotton later on in the film. And when we learn all these sort of rules and the institution of slavery itself, therefore, we're allowed to, and as soon as Steve McQueen sort of teaches the audience that, therefore he allows you to use these small sort of subtle things that really break down the spirits, that work through emotional elements, or cause a hope, for example. You know, there's little moments where it's like trying to write ink with blackberry juice and sort of the pain of that. The small things of just even visually seeing the lacerations of the whips on the back and sort of really feeling and wincing with that pain as they try to sort of dab it up and lingering and focusing on just how brutal it was. So instead of having these big speeches about trying to get free and even sort of the morals or the different types of slaves or the slave-master relationship, a lot of it is first by explaining a lot of this stuff, not necessarily through just by experience, not through exposition or anything like that, but explaining it and then using those sort of setups subtly to convey emotional impact and convey metaphors and visual metaphors in a lot of ways. I think the prime example and sort of highlight point of the film is the scene where Solomon is hanging from a tree by his neck and his feet are barely touching the ground. And we start off with this wide and we get a couple inserts of Solomon sort of touching the ground, and without saying anything, we sort of understand what's happening. He can breathe, but just barely, and his feet are just touching the ground. And then what happens? We get sort of that insert of him, scraping against the muddy ground, and then we hold him to a wide. And you go, wow, this is a really impactful shot. And then it keeps going. And then we see people in the background come out and they start doing their job. And then you realize, like, holy, this has been like 30 seconds and it keeps going. And we hold on that. So it starts off at being like, wow, that's a really powerful shot. And then you go, wait, why is this still happening? Is something going to happen? And then eventually at a certain point you go, oh no, this is it. This is the metaphor. That even though it was only 12 years in sort of the span of his life, it's a huge chunk of his life. That every day was long and exhaustive, and that he was just given a little bit of life to breathe. He had only a little bit of freedom, and only a little bit, and sort of is scraping and just living in this sort of constant anguish and pain. So I think as a visual metaphor for slavery, for the sort of ignorance that people thought, the people in the background, the other slaves aren't helping him out. There's one woman that gives him a little bit of water, but sort of runs away. In one part ignoring of it, the one part excruciating pain, where it's like almost worse. It would have been easier, say, if he were to die, this sort of slow degradation of the soul. Just this incredible scene where Steve McQueen has this sort of confidence to hold on this wide shot is incredible, and really gives home that metaphor of slavery. So in terms of the emotional impact, in terms of the intellectual understanding of this, it's communicated so simply, so clearly, so effectively through these visual metaphors, through these visual moments, that if you're an attentive viewer and you pick up on yourself, it's really rewarding. And it's not a movie that's going to explain everything to you, but it's really emotionally impactful when you're engaged in the movie. Now, the only reason why it's number 8 here on the list is because it's a year where I liked a lot of the other nominees personally. I liked Her. I thought Inside Llewyn Davis should have been nominated. I mean, those are some of my favorite movies of the decade, so I have a little bit of a relationship that way. It's also incredibly hard to rewatch. I've only rewatched it one other time for this video. It's just, and I don't even like thinking about it too much, so it doesn't occupy a lot of mental headspace for me, because it's just a difficult, harrowing, really hard to watch kind of a movie, but it's a necessary movie, and I think it's a movie that still will hold up in terms of being shown in history classes and things like that in high school and whatnot. So if you haven't checked out 12 Years a Slave, it's a tough watch, but just in terms of an incredible craft and specific decisions, whether it be Hans Zimmer's score is terrific and it not being big and grand, but ultimately I think it comes down to Steve McQueen being a director who understands the medium so well and toes that line and never goes into sort of the melodramatic element. He totally nails the truth and reality of it and hits it hard at sometimes and makes things super clear. And he's a terrific director, and I think 12 Years a Slave is one of his best. Then the final movie I'm going to be talking about on this video is going to be my number 7 pick, Argo.
We're responsible for these people. I'm responsible.
One of the most forgotten Best Picture winners of the decade, even though it sort of has a unanimous agreement that it's actually a good movie. A universally agreed upon, exciting political thriller, but never a movie that someone comes out and says, oh, it's my favorite movie of the decade, I loved it, I rewatch Argo all the time. I think a lot of people just watched Argo, really enjoyed it, and then went about their lives. But in terms of its historical context, I think it's really important to understand the Oscars as a branch, as an academy, as a group of people, and how much timing, people, and campaigning has to do with winning Best Picture than it does the quality of the movie. This was released in 2012 at a time when Ben Affleck was at the height of popular culture. He had his time in '97 winning Good Will Hunting as a young man with Matt Damon, that Best Screenplay Oscar win, and he was sort of the prime to be one of the next big stars. And then he stars in Armageddon and Pearl Harbor, but as his career sort of evolves, he gets caught up into the sort of celebrity gossip area and does a couple bad movies in a row, and now he turns from being the sort of Oscar hopeful to being a blockbuster sort of trash actor and falls into the dumps. And so what does he do in 2007? He steps behind the camera, directs his first movie with his brother Casey Affleck, Gone Baby Gone. It wasn't a huge box office success, but really well appreciated within the critics. Didn't lose money, and I was like, okay, this was an interesting thing for Ben. Maybe he should direct more. Maybe he should be a little bit more behind the camera. And then his next movie, The Town, a huge box office success, also had this critical acclaim, and he stars in the movie. And people are like, oh wow, this is the Ben Affleck comeback. He had Gone Baby Gone, now he's in The Town. It's him directing his movies. That's where the lane is. So when 2012 comes around, he stars in the movie. It's a big hit. A political thriller is going to have all these Oscar nominations. It's like, Ben is back. We want to celebrate Ben. He's our guy. He had a little bit of a rough patch, but he's back. And that's the sort of narrative that pushed, I think, Argo winning Best Picture. As a matter of fact, he wasn't even nominated for Best Director, which was one of the biggest surprises of the decade, but won Best Director everywhere else, won the DGA. Everywhere he was nominated, he'd won, and he did win for Best Picture. So that was sort of his achievement, this idea that Ben is back. This is his movie. He directs it. He stars in it, and we we want to celebrate him. And many times we see these comeback narratives be celebrated. Someone like Renee Zellweger before, older actors, someone like Gary Oldman, where it's like it's his time. But also it happens within Best Picture as well. The narratives that happen around it, and even the campaigning. They liked Ben. They liked that sort of comeback story, and they wanted to give it to him here. So I'm not saying don't watch Argo. Argo only won because of Ben Affleck, but it's good to remember the historical evaluation when we're critically analyzing it to know where it was and why it actually ended up winning Best Picture. But if you don't know, the movie is about a CIA specialist who is tasked with getting 6 Americans out of Iran during the hostage crisis, a really difficult time for Iran where there's a switch of power. And the Iranians essentially don't want the Americans out, so they have to disguise the Americans as a film crew. And I think the movie is probably the best version of this movie that you can make. A movie that sort of touches on the political elements and adds and does a little bit of the conversation there. But for the most part, it's a very focused movie. And that's what I love about movies. Movies that focus on the specifics. Movies that focus on the process. This idea of having a task and completing the task. The TV shows can be about hanging out with people and things like that. There are some great hang out movies and stuff like that, but for the most part, movies that are really great, I think, have a solid focus, have a sort of solid beginning, middle, and end, and are totally focused on that and explore the intricacies and the specificities of that event. And in this case, it's not really worried about the larger political themes for the most part. It's just about how are we going to get these people out. There's 6 Americans with the help of the Canadian Embassy. We're the CIA. How are we going to get them out? And then once they come up with a Hollywood idea, it's like, okay, how are we going to actually do this? Will it work? And then the execution of that. So it's to set up the execution, similar in a lot of ways to something like The Town with the heist movie and then executing it. I think Ben actually borrowed a lot from what he learned on The Town to deliver a really interesting, intriguing political thriller. And then, of course, with the Argo, of course, being a Hollywood story where they tricked Hollywood into thinking this movie is being made. So they have proof to get these people out. Then the CIA working with the Hollywood, so you have a lot of these sort of insider jokes with John Goodman and Alan Arkin, which are very funny, which from a structural perspective brings a lot of the levity that's much needed in the movie. And I think Ben Affleck, like in his directing career, to someone like Clint Eastwood, where he doesn't have a really specific, distinct visual style. He likes his handheld close-ups, but it's not necessarily as specific as someone like a Fincher or Wes Anderson in terms of visually stylistic, but he's very much interested in telling the story the best way possible, and that the story is ultimately, similarly to Clint, the main focus. The story is what matters most, and telling the audience all the stakes and that sort of tension and that thriller and that build-up. And Ben is terrific at that as a director. He is really great, and the movie is terrific at sort of having these beats and having these incredibly tense action almost moments where just a moving of a paper or trying to get one checkpoint or one stage is incredibly tense because of the unpredictability of the situation, that the odds are so low of success. Now, personally, the only reason why I don't love the movie is because I think it's an effective thriller, but it's not something that I've totally thought about. I think in terms of its historical relevance, it's going to be a movie that it's like, oh yeah, Ben Affleck, he's going to, of course, be remembered. He had a directing career. Argo, maybe not his universally acclaimed best movie, but it won Best Picture, so it's going to have some historical context. I just don't know how many people are going to say Argo is my favorite movie of the decade, and the only reason why it's at number 7 here is because personally, being a Canadian, I think everything I've read about the movie that they sort of royally screwed over the Canadians, and that this idea of Tony Mendez being this outlaw cowboy working for the CIA who did everything, and then, oh, we'll just say it's the Canadians, seem to be historically really inaccurate. So this idea of an American taking over another country's story and heroism and branding it as theirs really left a really bad taste in my mouth, and stealing something that really didn't happen. Even though it's a movie and whatnot, claiming that it is a true story, it is kind of deceptive, I think, in that respect. But that's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure you comment below. Let me know some of your favorite Best Picture winners of the decade. Stay tuned to next week, where I give my thoughts on 6 to 2 of the Best Picture winners, similarly structured to this. And subscribe to the channel. That's going to be a week from today. I always upload the videos Monday at 12 p.m. Eastern Time. That's about it. Until next time, stay tuned.